So in this video we're going to look at the UI changes that we've made in MODO 12, and these changes have been made to improve general workflow inside of MODO and also improve the new user experience, so trying to make MODO a little easier to learn out of the box. And to do this we've concentrated mainly on the MODO modes aspect of the UI for 12.0, and we've tried to make it more consistent. We've tried to reveal more functionality, and I'm also trying to encourage more of a kind of a single layout asset creation workflow rather than having to kind of jump around into different viewport layouts all the time when you're working. So I'm going to start by some of the changes that we've made to the 3D viewport. So at the top of 3D viewports now we no longer have the RayGL button. It always had, in my opinion, too much prominence in the UI. So the RayGL functionality is still there. It just can be found under the under this drop down. Just go to RayGL, and then you get the options for it in a little floating palette which you can pin. So the functionality is still there if you want to use it. Secondly, you'll notice that when you open MODO, the tool HUD is now no longer visible. Again, it's still there if you hold down Control Tab. So you can still access that functionality if you use it, but just by default it's off. And finally, the perspective in OpenGL under Preferences here, the flatness of perspective setting, that default has been changed from 40 to 60%, so you don't get that kind of exaggerated perspective. So we've made a very subtle change to the whole idea of what is item mode and what is component mode inside of MODO in an effort to kind of make item mode a little bit more obvious. So if I create an object here, you'll notice there's no wireframe visible, and you'll notice there's also no item mode button. So now MODO is kind of implicitly in item mode until you go into a component mode. And again, the wireframe isn't drawn. So if I select an item, what we've done is changed the item visibility and the selected item drawing here from wireframe to filled. I mean, you can still change that back if you want the old behavior, but just the default has been changed. We just wanted I just wanted objects to be visually different when you were in item mode, to kind of tell you that. So now to go into a component mode, you can either use the regular hotkeys or just click on the component mode button, and then to get into item mode, again you can either hit Shift Spacebar to go into item mode like you did before, or you can just click on the button again and it pushes you back into item mode. So I'll run through MODO modes from left to right. So in the top left hand corner, in an effort to kind of encourage you to or help you to work within a single layout, we've got these buttons which open various palettes. So we can open up the model tools palette, and that's actually quite useful because you can change this one to UVing, and yet still have access to the modeling tools, because a lot of the modeling tools are also useful in the UVing context. So you can open up the model palette. You can also open up the topology palette. Again, meaning you don't, when you're working, sometimes you need to do a little bit of retopology, and you don't want to go into a completely different layout to do that. So here you can just go to a new layer, and if you go to this drop down, we now have a topology viewport preset, so you can just load that in and then start doing your retopology. We've also under settings here on the topology palette added the foreground transparency, so you can alter the transparency of the foreground mesh there interactively without having to go into preferences to do that. And to go back to the default modeling layout, you can just go to the model base like that. So you can also access the sculpting, painting, vertex map and particle tools palettes from there, and you can also access all of the rigging tools as well. And I thought this was really important, specifically with MODO now having procedural modeling. That means that the whole process of rigging is now much more part of a kind of an asset creation workflow. So it has to be, rigging is now part of making models in MODO, basically. And for that reason, I've also added a palette for the schematic, so you can access the schematic if you need to whilst you're modeling something. So the next button along opens up a UV window in a palette, and you'll notice that we've added some new buttons to the top of the UV window, and these are designed to just kind of reveal a lot of the functionality that was already in this options menu, make it a bit easier to use and make it a bit more discoverable. So I'll just run through those. So the first one is auto spans. So if you're doing UDIM work, you can just turn that toggle on and off. The next one is the show overlap option. That's on by default. The next one is show distortion, and that's off by default. The next one along is to show the actual image, the selected image. So with that on in the images viewport here, if I select different images, that will change. So it shows selected image on. But obviously you can turn that off if you don't want to see the image. The next one is the show image aspect. So this image isn't square, so if I want to see that in its actual resolution or actual aspect ratio, then I can click that on. And finally, this button toggles the display of any background UV, so I can turn that on and off really quickly. And the final two palette options are for preview and also the preset browser. So the MODO selection mode buttons and also modifier buttons have now been grouped centrally. As far as the MODO mode buttons are concerned, the auto select button has been made smaller. Component mode buttons are exactly the same. Again, because rigging is now an important part of modeling inside of MODO, we've brought the center selection mode and pivot selection mode into the UI, made them more visible. Before they were kind of hidden under the item mode button. Now the material selection mode button is exactly the same. Still by default it still selects materials in the viewport, but we've added some or exposed some functionality that was hidden before, and that is that you can actually define what this selection mode is looking at. So it defaults to material, but you can also use it to select parts, smoothing groups and selection sets. So if I change this to selection set, I've got some selection sets assigned here, so you can select those directly in the viewport, and then if you hold down Alt, you can use the selection conversion to then select polys, edges or verts from that. So in terms of the tool modifiers, the big change is that we've moved the mesh constraint button from MODO tools, where it never really belonged, to where it does belong, which is in with all the other modifiers. We also wanted to make the kind of your experience of these modifiers more consistent. So we've also always had this ability to hold down Alt, and it gives you options for some of those modifiers. So symmetry would give you all the symmetry options, snapping would give you snapping options like that as well. Now by default the mesh constraint button wouldn't work that way. It would just give you you would click on that and then you'd have to choose what type of mesh constraint you wanted, whether it was primitive, background and so on. So what we've done is change it for consistency, and also to kind of reduce the number of clicks involved in applying a mesh constraint. So all you need to do now is just click on the button, and it's now a toggle. So what it does, it defaults to a background constraint, which you can just turn on and off really easy like that. If you want a different type of constraint, you can hold down Alt, bring up Options, and then choose a different one, maybe Guide. And then when you turn that off and then back on again, Guide is now the default, so it remembers whatever the last one you used was. So another reason for doing this is just to make it more obvious that you have actually got a background constraint active at any particular time, because before there was no visual clue other than there was something in MODO tools, and it just makes more kind of visual sense when you're running tools. So for example, when if I turn that off, when I go to the topology tools and run something like, say, topology tweak, it's now showing me all the various components of that tool preset. So to remain consistent and also reduce more clicks, we've taken the same approach with the work plane button. So now if I make a selection here, instead of clicking on the work plane button and then choosing from a list of options, clicking on the work plane button will align the work plane immediately to whatever's selected in the viewport, and then clicking on it again will reset it. If you want to access other work plane features, then you hold down Alt, go to Options, and then choose your options. So say I want to rotate my work plane by 45 degrees, OK, it rotates it, it toggles on because the work plane is now active. I click on it again and it resets it. So on the right hand side of MODO modes, we've pushed all of the kit icons all the way over to the right, and that just helps to kind of separate them from the rest of the modifier buttons. So it separates them into a definite group, and that just helps to kind of like declutter MODO modes generally. What we've also done is added functionality so you can actually manage what's going on with these kits. So if you click on this kits button, it brings up this little popover form, and it will list all of the kits that you have visible in the MODO modes viewport. And it also gives you access to the kit toggle enable drop down, so you can enable and disable any kits that you have installed in your system directly from here. Now this is really nice because it allows you to manage these kits directly in the UI. So for example, Unreal Bridge, if I'm never going to use that, there's no real point having it in the UI. It's just cluttering things up. So I can go to this drop down, set it to hidden, and that icon will disappear. Now there are three options you can have for some of them. Hidden hides it, obviously. Visible shows it as a button, which will then open a popover form, and expanded will show the entire contents of the form. So the final thing I want to show you is a modifier addition to the transform tool. So if I run the transform tool here, so by default you can just kind of click and drag anywhere and move an object around the work plane. You don't have to grab the handle. If you hold down Control, it's going to constrain it across that work plane. We also have the option to hold down Shift and Control and drag, and it will duplicate that object. But what we can also do now, if you run the transform tool, if you hold down Shift, Control and right mouse button, it allows you to do a kind of a third dimension move, or move the object towards you and away from you just by clicking and dragging in the viewport. So that's Control, Shift and right mouse button, and that will also work with action centers. So if I select this guy here, get rid of him. So, okay, so if I have this guy here and run the move tool, change the action center to screen, and obviously it's going to move across the work plane, but if I hold Shift, Control and right mouse button, it's now going to move towards me and away from me.